I am really excited to be speaking with you all this evening about my topic, which is bringing your whole self to data work. When I started with this topic, I thought about the concept of bringing one's whole self to work, which has become popular as a way of describing, for most of us, being laid back, being relaxed, not fearing judgment, wearing flip-flops, casual clothing, different ways of relaxing in shared or public spaces. And I thought about the idea of bringing one's whole self to different public spaces from the perspective of the majority, which in most cases is about relaxing, versus the perspective of someone who feels minoritized or who is distinctly identified as a member of a very, very small portion of the larger group. With that in mind, one of the things that I think is interesting to consider with regard to bringing one's whole self to any space is, are we talking about individual characteristics and aspects that represent who we are, or are we talking about differences from the larger group that we may be part of, or that we may be socialized with? An example that I use here is that the woman in the slide is someone who, we don't say anything, I'm not giving any examples of difference, but there are examples of difference just by introducing someone who looks differently from the majority of the group that they're participating in that create knock-on effects when you think about bringing one's whole self and the idea of choice. The idea that bringing one's whole self to any space is a choice tends to be a very majoritized viewpoint, because for many people who are part of a minority, there is no choice. You simply are different, and the bringing of your whole self really can just be introducing yourself into spaces that very few others look like you. Given the context of this hackathon and what we're all trying to do by utilizing, diving deep into and examining the data that's coming from large end surveys, I think it's clear that we want to use data as a mirror, or rather a magnifying glass, for reality. We want to believe that the data that we can solicit from different audiences is going to give us a picture, a snapshot, and some real representation of how people are living. It's important to keep in mind, though, that once we're dealing with large end surveys and data en masse, we have the dynamic of the majority and the minority, and the way statistics work is that in general, we tend to put more emphasis and we look in more detail at the numbers that are larger, at the norms that are more obvious. When we're talking about it from a statistical perspective, marginalize, exclude, or minimize the importance of the data that isn't reflected throughout the majority of the data set. What do I mean when I say outliers, minimizing, and statistical procedures that tend to isolate certain groups? This is just an example of a standard regression analysis chart that shows large amounts of data clustering in one area on one slope. When we're talking about math or data points that are unrelated to humans, it's easy to say, okay, what are the parts that fit? What are the parts that show a trend? And where are the data points that are not really related, don't seem to be correlated? We can exclude them. But we're not talking about data as math. We're talking about data as representations of human experiences and of populations. So what happens when we look at, in this case, the green data points that are not really mixing well, that are not following the same patterns as the overall data? Do we exclude them? Do we look at them as less relevant? Do we try as often happens, to determine what the differences are and focus on the differences between the outliers and the majority of the data that's clustered in a different place. This is what I would refer to as superficial pattern matching. This is the kind of pattern matching that's very commercial, that's very popular with our friends at Amazon, our friends at Netflix, all of whom are using algorithms and data analysis at a very high level to quickly and superficially create personas based on the data that they collect. The examples here are the kind of data that Amazon has collected about me, what kind of reading I do or I've done for any particular period, sci-fi mostly, for those who don't know. And the bottom is the kind of data that has been collected by Netflix about me in the last, I don't know, since the pandemic started, which you can see can easily create the impression of a one-dimensional personality outlook that it wouldn't surprise me if some analyst somewhere was thinking, oh, here's a homesick Korean, because all of the movies that I've been watching seem to be coming from the Korean drama sector. And this is somebody who we don't need to show anything other than science fiction to, because this is what this person reads, right? Of course, there's more to all of us than whatever the superficial trends or patterns or data collected with one goal in mind might reflect. Back to the statistical point that I made about how statistics typically are utilized to highlight the majority and undermine or exclude or look at differences between the minority versus the data that is overwhelmingly consistent. This is a study that's taken from the recruitment section of Life. It's a really interesting study, I thought, because it's one of the studies that Harvard Business Review referenced from 2016 to show the ways that statistically including a minority in a group that's overwhelmingly different from the minority does not work. The example that was given, and there's more examples than the ones that I show here, but the example that was given was that in a research group whereby you had 3 applicants, 2 of whom were white applicants, 1 of whom was a black applicant, there were, I think, no instances. It was very, very low likelihood that the black applicant would be chosen, whatever the job level, whatever the job title. In a pool of 4, because this was what the overall survey was looking at, in a pool of 4 where you had 3 men and 1 woman, there was statistically 0 chance that a woman would be chosen given same qualifications, looking for jobs across various different levels. Only when you had 2 men and 2 women did the chances of, statistically, a woman being chosen for the job increase dramatically, 79%, 79%, or no, not percent, times. 79 times more likely that a woman would be chosen just by increasing the number of women in the pool. And one of the things that was interesting for the overall conclusions of the survey was the authors of the survey who said, essentially, as long as you are working with one isolated outlier or person representing a difference from the other 2 or 3 or more in a pool, there was no way, statistically, that the individual who was represented, who is the minority, would be evaluated based on their qualifications or their qualities. They would be evaluated against the majority, and they would be either ignored or excluded because the preference would go to the characteristics of the majority group. This was something that was
intended to be a survey that looked at just how women did in pools that included women and men, mostly men, only one woman, but they also did a study that included 2 men and 2 women or minority candidates. And what they found there was the same effect held true. It was even stronger. The likelihood of choosing a woman or a minority candidate in a 2 and 2 kind of 4-person group was 179 times higher than where you had, you know, an overwhelming 3 or 2 of one type of candidate and only 1 minority candidate. The effect that I mentioned with the 2 and 2, where you have an equal amount of different characteristics, held no matter what the size, the n size, the effect was equally large regardless of the size of the survey. So what does that mean? What that tells us is that when we're looking at data in groups that are overwhelmingly one particular type, and we have some outlier who does not represent the same type as the majority of the participants, the majority of the data that we see, it's likely, just statistically, that we're going to start looking for differences. We're going to start trying to identify and create categories to isolate the outlier in the group, rather than tailoring the inquiry towards the things that might be in common throughout the different groups, regardless of their superficial differences. In this example, I have the obvious differences that you can derive from a group of men that has one woman. You can look at the length of hair, you can look at the fact, the evidence of glasses, you can look at whether they identify as male or not. But in terms of finding out what these groups might have in common, there are lots of questions that are not likely to be asked that could tell us a lot more about whether these groups with superficial differences actually have quite a bit in common based on their parental status, based on whether or not they're first generation or immigrants, whether or not they ride public transportation or they own cars. These are not the things that typically come to mind when we see an overwhelming majority faced with a very small minority. We typically think about what are the ways that these groups are different. It works differently when we have a group that's superficially all the same. And in this example, which I'm assuming most of you probably know, the people that are presented in this slide, you have the reverse of what we saw in the previous slide. You have a lot of women with very obvious similarities. And if you know who is represented here, you know that they're not only black women, they're not only women with PhDs, they're also women who speak English, who have worked in academic contexts in the data science area, and you can leave it there. And it would be very normal from a statistical perspective to leave it there where you have already identified categories into which all of the data subjects fit. But what I'd like to suggest is that there's more to be evaluated, there's more to be uncovered, and there's a lot more difference and diversity, even in a group that might superficially appear to be the same, than we might think there is to start with. The question about, that I add, would race make answers different, is an interesting one, because I use the picture of myself with a lot of data scientists with PhDs who are black women to highlight how likely it is that we immediately start to draw conclusions about the similarities. It's just as diverse, this group, as a group of white men who superficially have a lot of characteristics in common. There might be lots of things that they don't have in common that you will never get to if you're looking to fill out categories and create correlations that are easy. So where am I going with that? I'm going to the conclusion that most of you already know, but if you haven't heard it, I will reinforce that with this slide. The data is not neutral. and the ways that we collect it are not neutral, and the information that we gather and the assumptions we make about how to gather information, who's likely to respond to our request for data, and how they're likely to respond is all influenced by our level of familiarity and the level of comfort that those target audiences have with the people who are asking the questions and with the feeling that they have of being in the in-group versus being an outlier who is under special scrutiny. For organizations that are looking to incorporate more data and to be more data-driven in their approaches to outreach and organizing more civic engagement, it's important to understand who you are and what your biases may be before you develop the questions and you start to reach out to groups in hopes of getting their honest and their realistic experiences through data or surveys. It's important that we not only identify what our biases might be, what our assumptions might be, but also the ways that we create context by by extending credit and assuming that everyone shares certain things about our perspective that everyone may not, that we may not have proof that everyone actually shares. These are things like class, these are things like education, these are things like the ways that we engage with others socially, and the assumptions that we make, or we might make, about how everyone engages with others socially or deals with class or represents themselves in terms of educational level. The example I wanted to give here about data labels and unspoken assumptions comes from my own life, and I wanted to give this example because it's a really unusual one, I've found, but it made a lot of sense at the time when I engaged in it. So when my kids were small, my partner and I, who's an Austrian, decided that we would stop using color and we wouldn't use labels for skin color. We made a very conscious choice to do that because we realized that if we continued to use labels without context, that our children would grow up understanding through all of the implicit signals that we didn't explicitly give them what it meant to be black, what it meant to be white, and that without the context that we had had as adults who'd lived full lives and had a lot of different experiences with a lot of different people, it would be very likely for our kids to use these labels in whatever the most recent way that they'd heard these labels used as. So if they're hearing someone is aggressive, or if they're hearing that someone is obnoxious, or if they're hearing that someone is extremely generous and kind, and it's constantly connected to a skin color, then just like a computer, they're not going to have the context to know these are individuals with individual characteristics, and it's very likely that they would, without any other context, just make assumptions that attached to skin color. So we didn't use skin color, we used BP, WP, and for years my kids had no idea how we were describing in shorthand anything that had to do with racial categories or labels. They just thought curly hair, straight hair, accented, all of the descriptions that we wanted them to focus on when we were describing people that they themselves did not know, we thought was more useful to our kids in learning how to evaluate who people were than just telling them, oh, the black guy, oh, the white guy, because we understood that they would learn to think about people through these labels, and they would also pick up all of the hidden context that my husband and I have developed about these labels, and we didn't want that. With that in mind, Statistics. Back to using statistics and thinking about what they say when we look at large data sets and we're looking to get a representation or a picture of who people are. Because statistics aren't people, and people are not necessarily represented fully by the data that we collect about them, it's important to keep in mind that there's always another level of inquiry, and there's always another way to look at data correlations, look at disparities in data that can tell you more about individuals than simply the aggregate information and the information that seems to be incomplete may allow. It's very different to answer a question about discrimination, for example, if you are the lone Latina in a group of non-Latinos, than it would be if you were a Latino or a woman in a group of women being asked the same question about discrimination. There's a very big difference in the way that we represent ourselves and that we bring ourselves to our data representations, to our answers, to our workplaces and public spaces when we feel like we're part of a group that will allow us some anonymity, invisibility, versus when we're in groups where we feel like we might be minoritized or we're going to be under special scrutiny. We should all keep that in mind if we're looking at data that is meant to give us the real picture about equality, discrimination, and people's experiences en masse. What I'm really talking about is intersectionality and intersectional approaches to data, which mean looking at people beyond the labels and the categories that they might fit into most easily, beyond whether or not you have 6 white men or 6 black women or PhDs or German speakers, to look for the ways that even very disparate individuals and their responses in surveys or their responses statistically may have points of overlap. And digging deep enough to make sure that you're questioning where there are points of potential overlap, even amongst disparate groups. It's important to keep in mind that because, especially in Europe, which is becoming more and more diverse every day, there's not a lot of opportunity usually to assess what the honest feedback about equality, about discrimination is from minoritized groups. So we tend to not look into detail, and this is one of the reasons the Afrozensus is so unique and amazing, that you're looking into detail about how minoritized groups relative to the larger population actually experience equality, inequality, and what perspectives they bring in the same way that you would if they were part of the majority. And this is one of the things that is important. The majority groups, whether it's a large-scale survey or a smaller one, typically get the benefit of incredibly, if not intersectional, detailed and diverse cuts of the data, assessments of what people are going through and what their experiences may be. The problem is that when you have minoritized groups, most of the time it comes as an ad hoc and it comes as a less relevant, less interesting assessment that gets done. So this is an opportunity that we have by looking at data from marginalized, minoritized groups in more detail with real thoroughness to understand all the ways that these groups, as well as the majority groups, understand equality and experience diversity. My closing point is that talking about intersectional approaches to data and ways of looking at the data beyond the easy categories and labels that are the first things that usually show up in surveys especially, is that we all want to show ourselves in all of our glory and all of our diversity as individuals, whether or not we're part of a larger group or we are part of a minority within a larger group. And it's so much easier and it's so much richer, and we learn so much more about the people, the experiences, the systems that we're dealing with in Europe today when we get into the detail about who, what, how, where people define themselves, people's experiences could be defined, and we move away from categories like how you relate to the majority. E.g., for this example, which is mostly descriptions taken from my life, a person who is all of these different characteristics versus a person who is non-white and non-male. Thank you.
Thank you, Nakeema. Thank you for both the kind words about Afrozensus, but also for the way you really laid the foundation for this weekend and drew our attention to the importance of intersectional analysis and how this is not just a matter of big categories, but really about the contours of individual and collective experience, right? And I want to invite all of you to follow along as I will use Afrozensus as a showcase. I want to talk about conscientization, empowerment, and advocacy through community-based data interventions, using Afrozensus as an example. So to start with, Martin just said I'm also a member of the Initiative of Black People in Germany. I'm on the advisory board of this Black self-organization. And it was important for Afrozensus to also be lodged with Black self-organization. In this case, this is EOTO, Each One Teach One, with whom we partnered and who was the lead organization for Afrozensus. There you also see scientific partners and the funders, but thank you. But yeah, to jump right in, I wanted to share some impressions from our outreach because we prepared Afrozensus from 2019 on, not knowing that when we wanted to go into the personal outreach phase, COVID hit, so all of our outreach had to be done online. And so these are some of the visuals that we used. This is inviting people of African descent, Africans and Black people in Germany to share their experience. This next slide also hints at the fact that Afrozensus was conducted in 3 languages, but the visual representation also invites to think about the diversity of the communities that we were seeking to address and invite. This is the German tagline, for us, by us all, which hints not only at the fact that this was a Black-owned project, but also at the main addressee, which again are the communities themselves in their diversity. So the all hints at the idea that there's internal diversity, there's multiplicity of Black, African, and Afro-diasporic experiences and opinions, and that's what we wanted to capture as well. So as Martin has hinted at, and as Nakeema has also pointed to, there's a lacuna on these issues in Germany, but at the same time, such a project has been a long time coming because we position anti-discrimination and equality data gathering as an idea of, as a practice rather, of data activism and of data-based advocacy. And in that context, Afrozensus is a showcase for differentiated anti-discrimination data and equality data. And importantly, it showcases that anti-discrimination and equality data is about more than just diversity, right? It's about access, it's about anti-racism, and it's about advocacy. I'm also happy to stress that Afrozensus itself was also a showcase of collaboration with CorrelAid. And some of the visualizations that you will see and some of the analysis, some of the tool chains that we use for analysis were developed in close collaboration with CorrelAid volunteers. So Afrozensus is a showcase for collaboration, but also for the possibility to really use data to conscientize and to empower. And I'll give examples later. The basic idea is that in a context where these experiences are often misrepresented, are often budgetalized, are often denied, it is important to locate one's own experience in a broader context, and the data that we gather invites to do so. And in doing so, engaging with the data itself is a process of conscientization, of becoming more aware of the pattern, in this case of both anti-Black racism and of counter strategies. And becoming more aware, then of course the first step, hopefully, and we know this has been the case for some, the first step on a journey of empowerment, where the data then provides starting points for different kinds of engagement initiatives, both within the communities and vis-a-vis politics and other aspects of society. Now, of course, we know, and we might decry this, but it's just a fact, right? No data, no policies, right? Politics and advocacy need data, need numbers, need evidence, right? And in Germany, it's always the problem when you talk about certain perspectives, then the question will be, but yeah, well, are you really sure this is really a pattern? Is this really, maybe it's just happening to you, you know, it's just anecdotal evidence. So we needed to go beyond that. But of course, Afrozensus also presented a unique opportunity to ask ourselves, well, how are we? You know, how are we doing? How are we experiencing Germany through the lenses of our internally diverse viewpoints and standpoints, right? Of course, Afrozensus also helps to go far beyond a very popular German fairy tale, the fairy tale of the Migrationshintergrund, yeah, the migration background. Some of you are smiling, so I guess you know what this is. This is the absurd idea that people who are in Germany and are read as non-white, as people of color, must have a recent history of migration, right? Because it banks on this fantasy that not long ago, in the pristine, you know, original past, Germany was an all-white space. Now, of course, this simply was absolutely never the case, right? Never in history has this been true. But it is a persistent myth that is actually reinforced through the category of migration background, which is the only category still that is used as a proxy to discuss racial discrimination, right, in the German context. And some of you might think, yeah, well, I mean, it's a proxy, it might be a little bit weak, but why not? Well, let me show you what the issue here is. Both of these ladies, and who of you actually recognizes both of them? Okay. All right. One is an SPD politician, used to be a minister, now she is in the European Parliament, Katharina Barley. And Katharina Barley is of German and British descent. And that means statistically, she has a migration background, just as has the other person. And who of you knows the other person? Okay. That's Barbara Becker, an actress, and yeah, somebody who obviously, even though she's, you know, privileged among many lines, would certainly have a very different experience of everyday life than Katharina Barley. The problem is, when we look at statistics, we couldn't tell the difference between them. They're both lumped together in the same category, which speaks to what Nakeema just said in terms of the danger, right, of creating overarching categories. Another fun fact that is not well known about the migration background is only collected for 2 generations, which means that, for example, my children, my 2 black children, but also some black friends that I have who are here in Berlin in the 5th generation would not be captured by this category anymore, right? They're still black, they still make all the experience that come with that in the German context, but they're not captured in this only category that is used to approximate racial discrimination issues. So this tells you there is a problem with this category, and we have to move beyond it. Luckily, even the German state has begrudgingly, at the UN level, after having been asked about it repeatedly, acknowledged that yes, it's true, there are other groups, you know, beyond the migration background that are vulnerable. So we see here, yeah, the migration background, okay, doesn't seem to work. Anyway, the yellow field is the migration background, and the idea is that even the German state has now acknowledged some years back that yes, we acknowledge that there are groups such as, the Jewish community, groups such as Muslims or people that are read as Muslims, black people, and Sinti and Roma, some of whom might have migration background, many of whom do not. But these groups are acknowledged as facing heightened threats of racist discrimination. This is, of course, not a complete list. We would, for example, say one would have to definitely add people of Asian descent as well, right? So this is an issue of, well, ongoing advocacy. But the point here is simply to say that these groups exist, and obviously they also overlap, right? Which again creates specific effects of intersectional experiences. So if you are black and Sinti, right? If you are, Jewish and black, and so on. So it's important to look at these things more closely, which brings me to the concept that Nakeema already introduced, intersectionality, the complex ways in which these categories overlap in real life. Actually, if you think about it, for almost everybody, right? Nobody is just a one-dimensional being. However, power relations in society make it so that some of these overlaps, intersections, matter in different ways. They create experiences that others don't necessarily share, right? And, well, I won't bore you with too many details of this, but you know, when we talk about racism, it is important to have a bit of a foundation, and like Martin already said in the beginning, we take a human rights approach, which when it comes to racism is actually helpful, because unbeknownst to most people who debate this in German public sphere, there's actually a very strong definition of racial discrimination, and there's a whole human rights treaty that's just about protection from racism. And this is a very long definition that includes dimensions of race, color, descent, national or ethnic origin. And the idea is that any distinction, exclusion, or restriction or preference based on these ascriptions that has the purpose or effect of hampering the enjoyment of full human rights is racial discrimination. Now, importantly, the definition actually includes this wording here, the purpose or effect. And that is super important because it makes it so that a human rights lens on racism actually goes beyond the main, conceptual straitjackets that German discourse limits itself to when it comes to talking about racism. So, for example, in Germany, like in many other contexts, there's a fascination with intention. Oh, but did they really mean it that way? Not relevant if we take a human rights lens. It's not just about the purpose, it's about the effect, right? Also importantly, this takes us beyond the idea of individual bad apples. It really takes us into the realm of institutional and structural racism. And this is where data is key. Data is key to make these realities, these patterns, right, visible. And data is also even legally key as a proof to elucidate the context and these patterns that stand behind individual cases. So, moving on, zooming in on Afrozensus. Afrozensus is about the experiences of Black, African, and Afro-diasporic people in Germany, and so anti-Black racism plays a key role. Though, importantly, it's not the only thing we looked at in Afrozensus, right? We also looked at civic engagement, political opinions, so many other things. but we needed to define anti-black racism as a specific form of racism. And so our standpoint is that anti-black racism, of course, has a long tradition in Germany and in Europe since the time of the so-called Enlightenment, at the least. And importantly, this is a specific degradation, specific dehumanization, and individual but also structural racial discrimination of people of African descent. Now, importantly, this cannot be reduced to discrimination because of skin color. It's more complex than that, because these ascriptions of anti-blackness are shared, obviously, by people of different, well, skin tones, if you want to call it that, different shades of black. At the same time, of course, these shades also create different experiences, which we could also show in our analysis. This simply goes to show that anti-blackness is a specific form that needs to be analyzed and looked at in its specificity. Now, yes, there was insufficient data on all these issues, so our idea was to dig deeper. For that, we also identified different pattern and dynamics of anti-black racism, and this is something where, you know, our prior reflection actually fed into the analysis of the data, and we were then also able to find and confirm some of these patterns, such as othering and foreignization, where blackness is associated with not being of Germany or not belonging to Europe, the hypersexualization that goes with certain ascriptions of the black body, criminalization, the derecognition of competence, the de-individualization of black people and their homogenization, and the trivialization and the denial of anti-black racism itself. So, how to go about analyzing this? Well, we had to take different critical lenses on board to be able to do this work. This is one, Black or Africana feminism, which holds that intersectionality is fundamental to power hierarchies, and of course also to insights into domination and resistance. Like Nakeema showed, right? Looking at the world from an intersectional standpoint can also reveal certain things that you can't see from other standpoints, which is linked to the second bit, you know, for the sciencey folks among you, standpoint epistemology, the idea that really how you can understand the world is related to the position from which you look at it, which of course links to the idea of data feminism, the idea that data is never an objective description of the real world, but as we've just heard, perspectives on data, the instruments, method, and language around data, they are all biased, right? And we need to take account of this, which is what QuantCrit does. QuantCrit, like a critical school of data analysis that centers intersectionality and mobilizes critical race theory to actually rework some statistical methods to be able to gain different kinds of insights. So all of these inform what we call resistant data epistemologies. So the idea is, again, data are always partial, positioned, and therefore inextricably political and need to be handled and analyzed as such. So there were some data challenges having to do with Afrozensus, how to reach out to these communities, how to survey them, and how to operationalize this idea of intersectionality. Now, what's important for our work, and this is true for Afrozensus and all the other work we do, is that we believe that dimensions of discrimination intersect in complex, they interact, as these cogwheels do, in complex ways, right? So we have gender, religion, ascriptions of race or so-called ethnic origin, we have disability, age, sexual orientation, social status, and others, and more. And they all intersect, and it's important to really look at the intersection to understand realities of discrimination and exclusion. Now, as we've also heard, this is about difficult topics and very, very sensitive data, which is why we have an extensive set of principles for the collection and analysis and dissemination of such data, starting, of course, with voluntary self-identification and participation, the clear and extensive clarification of the purpose, the anonymity of the respondents that we guarantee, and the participation of representatives of such groups in every step of the process. the planning, the gathering of the data, the analysis, and the dissemination. And importantly, for intersectionality, the possibility to indicate several identity self-ascriptions, right? And key in the German context, after the horrific history of data having been part of genocides in this country, the principle of non-harm, right? Where we must guarantee that the data we gather is not used to harm the very population, to try and understand better in terms of highlighting discrimination and moving against it. Yeah, so I'll skip this. You can imagine how these things are discussed in the German context, not always in the most constructive way. What was important for us to also recognize that we were obviously not the first to do this. We were standing on the shoulders of giants in this. And here I'll just invite you to have a look at the Afrozensus. You find the whole text online, where we do like a callback, for example, to the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, a key figure in not just the African American, but also the Pan-African movement, who designed innovative data visualizations more than 100 years ago, trying to visualize black realities in the US. And here you see like the visual callback in the way we visualize the data to the incredible legacy of Du Bois. Here's another example of that, right? So here you see his visualizations from the year 1900, and there you see our visual callback of that. Now, moving on into the data now, we looked at experience of discrimination in 14 areas of life. You see them listed here, by order of severity of discrimination. And we find that most people, or the strongest experiences, are in public and free time, followed by media and the internet, followed by services and businesses, followed by the work life, followed by private life, followed by police, education, security personnel, housing market, public offices, health and care, justice, art and culture, and banks and insurances. So banks and insurances is at the bottom, interestingly, but even there you'll find that almost half of the respondents still report that they face discrimination in these contexts. Now, we asked for discrimination, and then we had people specify along which lines, and this clearly shows that anti-blackness is at the heart of the discrimination we just saw, because you see how racist reasons and ascribed ethnic origin and ascribed skin color are the most prevalent, but again, keeping in line with the idea of intersectionality, this is followed by gender, name, hair, social status, language, and others. So it is important to recognize how these things intersect, which is one of the key aims of our analysis. And I'm just going to lead you through a set of data to illustrate some of the ways in which we've tried to honor this idea of intersectional analysis here. So here you see the prevalence of discrimination in the context of professional life, work life. And here you see different categories of diversity. Here we have the number of African or Afro-diasporic parents. Here we have disability, educational status, citizenship, whether the person has an experience of having fled, being a refugee, gender identity, being a member of the LGBTIQ communities, having a Muslim context, and also income. Now, we hypothesized that, this is like a spread. So the idea is that in the German context, if you have one African or Afro-diasporic parent, you're likely to face less discrimination than if you have two. And you see here, so gray is always the privileged, in theory less discriminated, red is the less privileged, more discriminated context. And you see that this holds true along these dimensions. This means, for example, these are all black people, right? So the people of African descent that we surveyed that do not have disability as well report less discrimination compared to the black people we surveyed that have a disability. However, as you can see, this is the spread of 80% to 95. So this is a very high percentile already, right, in which this all takes place. Now, and you see, if you pay attention to the top bracket, African or Afro-diasporic parents, you see now I'm moving on to police, and you see how the data switches. So this really shows how you were able to actually zoom in, something that Nakeema also advocates for, to really be able to be specific, to zoom into specific contexts. So you see here the experience with police is obviously different from the experience with the education sector, but keep your eyes trained on the top bracket. And now we're moving on to private life, and there you see something interesting. It flips. Are you seeing that the top, the red bulb is now to the left, meaning that when it comes to private life, the respondents with 2 African parents face less discrimination in private life, right, than those with 1. Now give it a think for a second, right? Why might that be? Well, it's a sad but very obvious reason. It's simply that, if you have 2 African Afro-diasporic parents, it means you have, in this case, less white or less non-black family, right? Which means that your attack surface in your private surrounding is just less than if you have only 1 African parent. But this shows, again, how important it is to look at these contours in different contexts, to be able to understand, threats and dangers along these lines. Now, moving on, one other aspect that was key for us, and by the way, sorry, let me go back once. So analysis. So these are some of the visualizations that were also enabled through the collaboration with CorrelAid and experts in data visualization who also volunteered their time and expertise because they said we want to support such a project. So it's basically also a showcase of past collaborations, just like the one we're about to embark with you over this weekend and hopefully beyond. So just to throw in another kind of visualization, it was also important for us to showcase the internal diversity of self-understandings of respondents when it comes to how they self-describe. And so we offered people a range of descriptions such as Black, Afro-German, person of color, African, African diasporan. And this upset plot simply showcases the complexity, right, of the self-identification of the thousands of respondents who answered this question. Now, I can't go into the detail of this, but just to say we did a mixed method design where we also did interviews and focus groups. And here you see a visualization of focus group content that is from a focus group with Black medical doctors. And they're talking about how anti-Blackness shows up in the medical system in Germany and how they as Black doctors navigate this. Yeah, it's just another showcase of collaboration with CorrelAid, because it was CorrelAid data scientists who helped us to really hone this and other visualizations that really help us to grasp the complex content of what people have been sharing. Now, I'm coming to a close by talking a bit about the impact of Afrozensus. So we had a huge national and international media echo when we released in December last year, but importantly, we also had a very sustained community echo that goes on until this day. So people have given us the feedback that yes, our hopes that we would be able to offer data for people to contextualize the experience were really fulfilled. People said, yes, this idea of conscientization actually works because I can put my individual experience in this bigger context. So I can understand the pattern and I can move beyond societal ascription of, oh, it wasn't so bad, and really understand the context of my experience. Importantly, it also helps people to recognize that the problem they're facing is not personal, it's not about them, it is structural, it's about society, it's about Germany. It also helps people to recognize community-based strategies of dealing with, responding to, protecting oneself, and isolating oneself as best as one can in some contexts from anti-Black racism. Another key thing is empowerment. People have told us things such as, this is a milestone for us. I used it as my grant application, my project proposal. People have told us this has helped me in conversation with my teacher, my professor, my colleagues, my family. And the last bit that I promised in the title is advocacy. And just a few weeks back, I was at the annual Bundestreffen, annual meeting of the Initiative of Black People in Germany, where I was approached by a younger Afro-German woman who said, hey, I'm a black social worker, and I'm actually writing my BA thesis on the question, what should we now do now that we have Afrozensus, right? How should I, as a black social worker, do my work now? How can this data inform my first professional steps after I leave uni? So we had the use of AZ data, Afrozensus data in the media, as well as in advocacy efforts at every level, federal level, state level, city level. And I will not go into details of this, but I just want to tell you that this is also due to the fact that within Afrozensus, we have bifurcated the recommendations for action that we've given. So it's not just about showing data, it's about actually thinking, what does this mean for whom? And so we have recommendations for political administrative action. At the general level, for example, there needs to be a commission on anti-black racism and other things. But then we also always, in every chapter and for every topic, have recommendations for action for the Black, African, and Afro-diasporic communities. One, of course, because we cannot wait for state and officials to figure stuff out. We need to act now. But also there are things that we can and should and must do internally within our own communities, where we, of course, also have internal hierarchies and different experiences, as the intersectional analysis shows us. And so this kind of bifurcation also allowed people to engage with the data in meaningful ways in different contexts. Yes, and with that, I would close with another social media card that takes inspiration from a Fela Kuti song, in West African Pidgin, Hu no no go no, right? And so because of Afrozensus, there is more to know, but Afrozensus also showcases how much more can be done and needs to be done with intersectional data analysis. And that is why I'm really happy that this is the kickoff of a hackathon that will enable all of us in this room to advance this kind of analysis and these kind of perspectives further. Thank you.